to the OPEB Trust Oversight Committee. As soon as I sit down, well, actually, I won't sit down. Do we need to do the pledge now as well, or do we could do?
So we
just do it
actually
one
deferred
time?
that to the regular meeting.
Okay, great. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Syak.
Here.
Councilmember Rennie.
Here.
Vice Mayor Spector.
Here.
Mayor and Chair Jensen.
Here. And again, welcome. All right. So we have a couple items on our OPEB agenda this evening. First, I'm going to ask, well, we have consent items. So does anyone want to pull any item from our consent calendar this evening? Seeing no one on the council or in the audience, do I have a motion?
So moved. Second.
Moved and seconded, all in favor? Aye. Verbal communication, I do have one card, which I assume is says it's on an agenda item. Anybody else want to talk in verbal communications about something that's not on the agenda? Seeing no one, we will move to item number 2, which is asking the council to adopt the recommendation of the Council Finance Committee to invest additional discretionary payment assets in the California Employers Pension Pre-Funding Trust Strategy 2 and provide direction on an asset transfer methodology. Mr. Andrews, I'm assuming you're going to give us the report?
Correct. Thank you, Mayor and Town Council. The past year, this body, in conjunction with the regular Town Council and the Finance Committee, have taken a series of actions related to our pension benefits and our 115 trusts. Back in September, this committee directed staff to basically use the funds that had been accumulated to help reduce our unfunded liabilities by making payments to direct amortization bases at CalPERS. And so in October of last year, we did exactly that. The first payment of roughly $4 million was transferred directly to CalPERS to pay an amortization base. And then based on prior instruction from this body, we were prepared to then make the next payment of an additional base sometime at the council meeting we discussed between now and September, but staff was probably going to administratively set it up to happen before May 1st. This body also directed staff, when we closed PARS, to then go ahead and open up a new 115 account with CalPERS. And we went ahead and did that. And once the account was open, CalPERS offers 2 asset allocation options. And so we went before the Finance Committee in February to get their insight into which asset allocation they wanted to recommend to this body. At the Finance Committee meeting, they ultimately recommended Strategy 2, but that was with several caveats. The conversation at the Finance Committee evolved beyond the original scope of the agenda item and started to really focus in on the methodology of how funds would be moved from the 115 Trust to CalPERS. At the prior meeting of the Oversight Board, as I mentioned, staff thought we had clear direction to do it in 2 increments, and unless tonight's discussion changes that direction, that would still be our intent. However, at the Finance Committee, they did bring up a valid point, which is going forward, as this 115 vehicle continues to accumulate assets when the council has the ability to add additional items. There was a lot of concern about monies just remaining idle and not having any type of a mechanism to make sure that assets move from the account directly to CalPERS. And so with that being said, you'll notice that there's the recommendation for the strategy, but then we would also like this body to consider the potential of adopting some form of internal methodology so that we know that as assets are accumulated, any concerns about them remaining idle and not being moved to lower the unfunded liabilities won't be an issue. With that, we're available for any questions and discussion.
Okay, thank you. Questions for Mr. Andrews? Ms. Spector?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So, well, I'm going to back it up a little bit so I can structure my question. How much currently, I understand what you're saying about future funds, but how much do we currently have to contribute to CalPERS?
So currently we have about $4.2 million, and there is a additional long-term amortization base that had been identified by Bartel that's in the vicinity of about $3.7 million.
And so that I understand it, is that 4.2 plus 3.7?
No,
Or 3.7 is, well, you tell me.
4.2 are roughly the assets that we currently have available, and 3.7 would be one way to utilize those assets.
Now, as I read your report, in fact, before we received information from the community, my question to you would have been, did the Finance Committee have a recommendation regarding the timing of future contributions? And do they have a recommendation as to whether or not it should be a single contribution? So I guess I would like that answer specified as to current funds available and separately as to future funds.
Thank you. So the Finance Committee actually discussed both scenarios. First, they discussed just in general the concept of some type of mechanism that would just force contributions. They discussed it in terms of 1 month increments. Every month, assets would be deployed. In consultation with CalPERS and just our own internal procedures, 1 month administratively would probably be problematic. And so in the staff report, we mentioned that if we were going to move forward with that, we would recommend 3 months. Even though it's 3 months increments versus 1 month, you still get to the underlying premise of dollar cost averaging, which is making sure you have different entry points into the market at any particular time. That being said, Commissioner Tinsley in particular was surprised to hear that the payments being made to CalPERS were basically happening in 2 increments. First, the $4 million increment to pay off one long-term base, and then the $3 million increment that had been identified to pay off an additional base. When the Finance Committee started to speak to the issue, they kind of blended the 2 conversations, and it was staff's understanding coming out of the Finance Committee that the recommendation from the Finance Committee included the $3.6 million as having those monies go through an incremental methodology, which is why we created a table to illustrate what that would look like. The table on page 4 of 5 kind of shows what staff believes the existing guidance is, which would roughly be a $3.6 million payment sometime in the April timeframe. And then there'd be some residual assets left that we could move in the July timeframe. It was our understanding that the majority of the Finance Committee was thinking they wanted to also include the assets that are already there, and so that would roughly break down to about $1 million per quarter over the next 4 quarters until the assets are extinguished. I think the takeaway is that the Finance Committee had concerns just about funds remaining idle, and while I think a methodology to make sure that assets continue to move is good, if we were to pursue that path with the existing funds, it will actually take longer for the assets to get to CalPERS over the long run. And so from a staff perspective, I think we're still comfortable moving forward with the original guidance, which is to make the next payment and pay off an entire amortization base. But going forward, I think having a methodology to ensure that when assets are identified by council, that they are assured that they will move to CalPERS in a methodical fashion.
And when you say in your staff report that there was an administrative challenge with doing it monthly, is the challenge that there's work entailed and there's no time to do the work, or that it's not fiscally possible with CalPERS to do it on a monthly basis? What was the challenge?
Most of them are procedural. So for instance, when we contact CalPERS to tell them we've identified a base that we want to pay off, they then have to recalculate what that base actually is, because when we get an actuarial valuation, it's assumed over a 1-year period. But if we do it at a different increment within that 1-year period, they will go and recalculate it. Similar if you were to pay off your mortgage early or something, they would calculate interest to that day. So for them, that takes a little bit of time. So we start the dialogue with them. It takes a little bit of time to do it. They come back to us with what a payoff number is. Then we have to start putting in process the actual wire transfer. That creates paperwork both ways. It just seemed that the month time frame for both parties, ourselves and them, we just didn't think was realistic, especially to do it on an annual basis, month after month after month.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a question that's pretty much a follow-up to that. I was going to ask, what's the basis of staff's recommendation on page 4 of 5 that we do it, if we do a scheduled payment, that we do it quarterly? Is that just what you explain, that the rates change over time and that it's impractical to do it on a monthly basis?
Correct.
Do you-
From CalPERS' perspective, even though administratively they can facilitate our request, they're not necessarily pleased about quarterly either, and it is a lot of legwork on their end.
So you anticipated my next question, is that does quarterly make sense, given the challenges that you've identified, or not? And I think I just heard you say it doesn't make sense necessarily.
Administratively, it's a challenge, but that doesn't negate the fact that dollar cost averaging is an appropriate methodology because it ensures that you're going to get different exposures to the market at different times. And so whether that's quarterly or every 6 months, conceptually, it's a sound concept.
I understand that conceptually. What I'm trying to do is understand what is the best approach for the town. I'm convinced that monthly doesn't make sense. I'm not convinced that there's necessarily enough change, if you will, in what we're going to get for investment over a quarterly time if we do the dollar cost averaging. So I'm trying to figure out what's the optimum amount of time. So particularly if you assume a market like we have now in the last couple weeks, we'd obviously want to be putting it in or out at strategic times. So what do you think that the optimum, if we were going to set a schedule, what would be the optimum timing for that?
I would say either quarterly or biannually.
Okay.
And part of it also, so ideally, to have this conversation, we would be talking about the exact same amount of assets every year, year after year. The reality is we'll probably fluctuate in assets, and so even though we'll be getting different market exposures, we might not necessarily be getting the same exposures for the same dollar amount. And so in that regard, there's really nothing we can do about that. But I think biannually would work just as well as long as we do it every 6 months in the foreseeable future, because the whole concept of dollar cost averaging is that you do some type of methodical, systematic dollar amount on a regular basis.
Other questions for Mr. Andrews? Okay, I do have one card from Terry Duryea.
Hello, Madam Committee Person and committee members. I'd like to add to the staff report. As you know, I'm a member of the Finance Committee, and this is what I'll call the rest of the story. As stated in the staff memo, the Finance Committee did recommend investing additional discretionary assets in the SEEP Strategy 2. But in the staff report, we did talk about it just now by Mr. Andrews. In the staff report, it omitted any discussion of the recommendation that the fund should stay in the SEEP no more than 1 year before being transferred to CalPERS. I believe this is a key reason why the Finance Committee recommended Strategy 2, even though it had a lower target return than Strategy 1. The SEEP alternative was presented by staff as a place to park the funds on a short-term basis, as the expected returns in Strategy 2 were higher than the town would receive if the funds stayed in the town's short-term investment pool. I'm just reiterating what Mr. Arnn, I believe, just said. Excuse me, Mr. Andrews. So in summary, as Mr. Arnn said, the Finance Committee was concerned that the funds not remain idle. Therefore, I recommend that the committee add a provision to the staff recommendation that, quote, the intended use of the SEEP Strategy 2 is a temporary stop before transferring funds to the CalPERS or another preferable investment, and that no fund should be held in the SEEP Strategy 2 for more than a year, end quote. Now, in addition, we have the topic of really two topics, and it's easy to confuse them. We have the $3.7 million that currently and my memo was wrong, that currently is in the town's short-term investment pool, not in PARS, and that we have the additional money that takes it up to 4.1, I think,
roughly.
4.2. With respect to the 3.7, the staff report offers an alternative, a quarterly payment methodology, that it would move it out of the town's short-term investment pool. As stated, the council has already directed staff to transfer the funds to CalPERS prior to September 2020. That council has already stated that. Now the staff is offering a proposal that defers that until the end of January 2021. There's no reason to wait. I recommend the committee adopt the staff alternative to follow the prior implementation guidance, the second of the two alternatives. The staff memo provides a clear benefit of investing the $3.6 million with CalPERS prior to May 20th, May 2020. The memo provides no advantages to support a delay beyond that date.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
giving-
Let's see if you have any questions. You do. Vice Mayor.
Thank you. I'm going to have the same type of questions for you as I had for Mr. Andrews. I want to make sure that we're all talking about the same amount and funding of money. Do you have page 4 or 5 of our staff report? Or if not, can you get it?
I have it in front of me.
Okay. We have a quarterly payment methodology, and then we have a prior implementation guidance. Are you suggesting that we do the 3.6 on or before, I think you said May 1st? Is that
Yes,
what you
that's
said?
correct. Basically follow the prior implementation guidance.
Okay,
There's
well,
no
for-
reason to make a
For
change.
people who don't remember what the prior
Yeah.
implementation, I want to understand. And what about the amounts of money in excess of the 3.6?
Well, so the amount in excess of 3.6 is a much smaller dollar amount. So as Mr. Andrews suggested, as the dollar amount gets smaller and smaller, the idea of dollar cost averaging becomes less significant. The risks of dollar cost averaging becomes less significant.
And when would you suggest that money be?
I would follow the second alternative, the
Okay.
prior implementation guidance.
All right. Thank you.
Other questions? Thank you very much. Mr. Fagot? Okay, I'm going to close the public portion of this item and look to the council for any further questions of staff and/or, well, let's do questions first, because I actually have a question. Ms. Sayak.
So, Mr. Andrews, I'm looking at page 4, the same chart that everyone's looking at. With the prior implementation guide, is it just possible, and it's a simplistic question, to just split that amount in two so that it's not lump sum at 3.6 immediately? And so we're just splitting 2.1 in April and then 2.1 in July?
You could.
Is there any pros or cons to, because I understand the quarterly payment methodology and the reasoning behind that. And so I'm trying to look to see if there's a reason why we wouldn't want to split the 4.2.
There isn't one. What staff was trying to do was first kind of illustrate what the Finance Committee wanted to present to you. It wasn't necessarily an item brought forward by staff, and then illustrate what the prior guidance had been from this body. And so in terms of dollar cost averaging, if you were to do equal increments of 2.1, you would achieve the same result. The only difference is you would have less of an impact on the actuarial valuation that would be calculated for the
see.
following year.
Okay.
If all the payments are done before May 1st, then they will actually be part of the calculation of the new actuarial report, and everything else held equal, whatever the market does and any other actuarial changes they do, it would reduce the payments that are required by the town.
Okay, thank you for reminding me of that. Thank you.
Vice Mayor?
Thank you. Mr. Andrews, going back to your answer that you just gave to Ms. Sayak, given the fact that CalPERS will be making a May calculation, for lack of my better term, why not do the whole entire 4.2 before May 1st? What would be the advantage, disadvantage?
And we could do that also. The reason I illustrated the 3.6 is because when the conversation of paying directly to CalPERS came to this body, the Bartel illustration that was kind of the basis of the conversation really revolved around two long-term amortization bases. We paid one of them, and then this would be roughly the dollar value of the second one. And so we were trying to make sure that we kept the conversations aligned with how you had previously spoken about it. But that being said, there's nothing to say that we couldn't pay the entire base that had been identified, which is roughly 3.7, and then pay a partial payment on another base prior to May 1st.
All right, and so I guess I'm trying to get from you sort of the same thing I was trying to get from the speaker. Are you making a recommendation, and if so, what is the financial basis for that recommendation?
So prior to going to the Finance Committee, staff thought we had pretty clear direction and was comfortable with how the discussion and the implementation went at the prior meeting of this body. We were comfortable that we made the first payment as we said we would into the 0 to 3 month time frame and made a payment in October. And then we were comfortable that we would make another payment in, I believe we said the 3 to 12 month time frame. And that is something that, as we've said, we would do probably in the April timeframe to make sure we capture any savings prior to May. So we're comfortable still utilizing the prior direction. I went back and watched the conversation, and I think it was a good conversation, and we ended up with a fairly clear understanding of how we were going to transact the ADPs to CalPERS, and I'm comfortable maintaining that and recommending that.
Mr. Rennie.
Thank you. So, Mr. Andrews, my recollection of the discussion at Finance Committee, being a Finance Committee member, actually, I think I might be the chair now. We had a discussion. There was some mention of Mr. Tinsley being surprised something was transferred, and then or somebody did, and then actually, maybe I'll back up and start my statement and question over. So there was a transfer that we took directly from PARS to PERS, and Mr. Tinsley's name was mentioned, and he was okay with this transfer because we took it out of an account that has a market exposure and moved it to a market exposure. So we felt like we weren't really changing our market exposure. And then the discussions were, with the rest of the funds, we should put it in monthly, is the number we talked about, because you want to spread your risk out or actually reduce your risk by putting it in monthly and getting different market exposures. So, for example, the market just crashed 15% or something recently. If we had it in a fund that was 100% exposed to the Dow, for example, we would have just lost 15% on it. So the idea of spreading it over makes sure that we don't make the absolute wrong timing kind of thing. And I think there was a comment earlier about, trying to time the market, and we don't want to do that either because you frequently are wrong. So the common sense way that the Finance Committee talked about was this: do it over time, so we're not trying to time the market or mistime the market or anything of that sort. This leads up to my question, though. So the Finance Committee was saying we wanted to spread what was left monthly over a year, or actually I recall 18 months, a year or 18 months. It depended on the amount. My question, though, is, so you came back with quarterly, so I assume you had a discussion with CalPERS that this was sort of a compromise, that they said, monthly is going to be too much of a headache for us, and yearly is too risky. So this is the result you got, was quarterly from their discussion with them.
Yes, but the discussion was based on administrative practices, not necessarily market dynamics. And so I just want to make that clear. The Finance Committee talked about it the way you just described, and I don't want to speak for Mr. Tinsley, but he took dollar cost averaging in the pure sense as you would, like if you had automatic deductions from your, into a 401k, where it should be the exact same dollar amount each time. And that is a pure definition. dollar cost averaging at a broader level, which is the way it was discussed at this body the last time, is just ensuring that you get different market exposures, because you're right, you don't want to time the market, you don't want to try and, get one market exposure, you want to try and get different market exposures. And so for us, that equated into the two payments, the $4 million that happened in October and what would be an additional payment of somewhere in the vicinity of $3.7 million or more prior to May 1st.
All right, thank you.
Okay, I have a question. Mr. Andrews, assuming that my primary goal, or a person's hypothetical primary goal, is to do what I can to reduce our pension obligations and to have the greatest impact I can on those obligations from the dollars I put wherever I put them. And assuming further that I'm not particularly interested in playing the market for investment purposes, what I'm trying to do is use those dollars to impact my future liability. If that's what I want to accomplish, what would you recommend of the options that are given us in our staff report?
Thank you. So from an actuarial standpoint, once CalPERS has the assets and they do the actuarial calculation, our town will have, in theory, reduced our liability. When staff brought this conversation the last time, and part of this was we introduced the concept of dollar cost averaging, because even though from an actuarial standpoint we will achieve the goal, there is an element of market timing in the sense that the assets that we give to CalPERS, they're basically held in a large mutual fund. And so when you give them assets, you get exposure to the market through their portfolio. And so that's when we said, the assets we currently have is approximately $10 million. That was a fairly large percentage of the total assets that the town had. And so that's when we said, let's break it up into increments. So from an actuarial standpoint, all the dollars should go by May 1st. From a portfolio theory kind of market dynamic standpoint, multiple exposures are prudent.
Okay, bearing in mind that we're not a Fortune 500 company, but a municipal government, which would you recommend?
As I stated earlier, staff was comfortable with the prior direction we had. We were comfortable making the first payment in October, and we would be comfortable, if this body wants us to continue, to make an additional payment prior to May 1st. That being said, future assets, I think the concept of some type of mechanism that was discussed at the Finance Committee is a good idea, but I think that doesn't necessarily have to come into practice right now. We were comfortable with the direction we had.
So just to make sure I understand that you're comfortable with the prior direction, you'd like to get it invested per the prior direction, but going forward, you think it's a good idea for the council to set a timetable on future assets?
Correct. I think, this is pretty much going to deplete most of the monies that have been accumulated to date. And we will have a vehicle, if this council agrees with strategy 2, we will have a vehicle to start accumulating assets again. Staff will come before this body again when there's enough assets to say, would you like us to target additional ADPs? That has been the practice to date, it looks like, but we will ask the question again. Or even through the budget discussions, if this council, in future years or this year, as you start to identify surplus dollars that you want to use towards lowering assets, you can say, and I want these assets depleted within a 12-month time frame.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Mr. Rennie, I saw you first, then Vice Mayor.
So we haven't talked much about, if we go with your plan here of the 4 quarterly payments, currently the money sits in town 2% interest account. In this recommendation, the Finance Committee is saying we should set up or I think we already said we're going to set up a PERS account. We're trying to choose which PERS account, and we said it's supposed to be short-term parked money. So the conservative one to choose was about a 4% long-term average, and CalPERS funds are somewhere between 6 and 7 long-term, correct? And so we would put this money into the short-term until we make these quarterlies, right? So theoretically be getting 4% until we're ready to move it into the 6 to 7%.
Correct. And I don't want to continue to characterize the quarterly payment stream as staff's recommendation. We're just illustrating the conversation that came out of the Finance Committee. Do we think it's prudent to have some type of methodology to ensure that payments get made? Yes, but this wasn't necessarily driven by staff. It was more our ability to reflect what came out of the Finance Committee in comparison to the prior guidance we had.
Vice Mayor?
Thank you. To beat a dead horse, again, on page 4, I hear you saying, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong, I hear you saying that the quarterly payments reflect what you heard the Finance Committee say, but it was not a motion, correct?
Correct.
But that, and this may be further than you want to go, but I seem to hear you saying that the prior implementation guidance is you're comfortable with that or you prefer that.
When staff brought this before this body the last time and when the motion was made, and near the end of the conversation was actually discussed a few times because implementation was deferred to staff, but then a couple council members said, I'm comfortable deferring to staff, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. And so we did talk about making sure that we broke it up into 2 payments, pay 2 amortization bases, that we would do it in a way where it was over a period of roughly 12 months, and that was something that we were pleased with the result of the outcome of that discussion. So I would still say yes. If you're asking me, do I recommend this? Yes, I would still say I recommend it based on the conversation we had at the last Pension Oversight Committee meeting.
Thank you.
Ms. Sayak?
I have no questions. I'm ready for a motion.
Go for it.
Okay, I move to adopt the recommendation of the Council Finance Committee to invest additional discretionary payments in Pension Strategy 2. The direction I'd like is to follow prior implementation guidance. And so specifically on page 4 or 5, that's outlined as 3.6 for April with the remaining in July. And then I would like to, for future assets that we are being looked at, that we move from the monthly recommendation to the quarterly. And that's what.
Is there a second? Okay, I'm going to second that. Any comments or questions on the motion? Mr. Rennie?
Okay, I just want to be clear. Ms. Sayak said a finance recommendation, so part of that was the finance recommendation, of which was to invest while we're waiting to go into the full CalPERS account in the strategy 2, but the Finance Committee recommendation was to do dollar cost averaging, and her motion does not do that, so I won't be supporting it.
Okay, any other comments or questions on the motion? Ms. Spector?
I wanted to support the motion, but I'm not prepared to do that because of the last component about quarterly. The first 2 components of the motion I'm prepared to support, but not the last component.
Okay, we're going to, unless there's a change in the motion, we'll call the question.
May I amend my motion?
Yes.
So
but
I'm
you may
gonna
lose your second. But
Okay.
try it.
Okay, so I'm going to focus on just the 2 and see if we can make some action there. That we adopt the recommendation for the Pension SEP Strategy 2, that we utilize the 4.2 as guided in our prior implementation. And those are, I'm focused just
All
on
right,
those 2.
I'll second that as well. Comments or questions on that motion? Okay, I'm going to call the question. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? No. It passes 3-1. Councilman Rennie opposed. If someone would like to make a motion regarding future allocation of assets, independent of the motion that was just made, for perhaps the Finance Committee to discuss or to bring back straight to council, it would be appropriate if someone cared to do that. If not, we'll stop.
I'll make a motion that for future allocations, that this go back to Finance Committee with specific guidance and recommendations.
Second.
Okay, that motion's been made and seconded. Any discussion or questions? Seeing none, all in favor? Aye. Opposed, none, that passes unanimously. Okay, I think that that is it for the OPEB oversight. Thank you very much.